Welcome, weary traveler. You've stumbled across another whisper in the dark, another forgotten corridor of time, waiting to be gently uncovered. Before we begin, let me ask, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What hour has found you seeking solace in this quiet place? Leave a comment if you'd like. There's something comforting about knowing others, strangers from distant corners of the earth, are drifting into sleep with you, guided by the same voice, carried by the same current of curiosity. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. Not for the noise, but for the silence that follows. For more evenings like this, where history doesn't just speak, it. Now, dim the lights if you can. Turn on a fan. Let it mimic the old wines of forgotten villages. Lie back. Sink a little deeper into your blanket. Let the past pull you under, like a tide returning to the sea. Tonight, we descend into the hushed alleyways and creaking floorboards of medieval Europe. A place of iron and incense, of plague bells and broken bread, where saints and sinners walk the same crooked streets. And in this world, brutal, beautiful, unyielding, to be different was to be cursed. To be disabled was not merely to suffer, but to vanish. But they were there. In the shadows, the margins, the corners no one wrote about, the deaf boy in the monastery, the one-legged soldier turned beggar beneath the archway, the mother who never walked again, yet taught her children scripture from a straw bed. They lived, and they endured, and now they are remembered. Let us begin. The morning stank of damp wood smoke and animal fat, clinging to the frozen air like regret. The sun hadn't yet broken through the low gray clouds, and perhaps it wouldn't. In many parts of medieval Europe, light was more a rumor than a promise. In a tiny hamlet, barely a smudge on the map of Christendom, a child was born twisted. One leg bent in on itself like knotted rope, a hand missing. His mouth curled in a way that frightened midwives. No one said anything at first. Only the wind spoke, moaning softly through the thatched roof like a mourning ghost. The mother, pale and silent, held the child to her chest. She did not weep. But the priest, summoned by the whispered panic of the village women, crossed himself before entering the home. That gesture, that small, silent motion, meant more than words ever could. They feared what he was. Not who, but what. Had the devil marked him in the womb? Had the mother sinned in secret? Was this child a punishment, or a test? There were no hospitals, no diagnoses, no understanding. Only stories, and in stories, monsters came malformed. Prophets too, sometimes. So they waited, watching. The child, against expectation, lived. By 10, he dragged himself through the mud with his good arm, his eyes sharp and knowing. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. There was a strange poetry in the way he described the world, the shape of trees, the song of birds before rain. It unsettled some, others called it a gift, but never a blessing. To be disabled in this time was to exist in a riddle. On Sundays, they prayed for his soul. On weekdays, they ignored him in the fields, and every once in a while, someone would leave bread at his door, never knocking. Charity was a virtue, but pity was a poison. What, after all, could he contribute? In a society built on the strength of the back, the quickness of the hand, the endurance of the body, where did a child who couldn't walk belong? He could not till soil, nor build walls, nor swing an axe. So he listened, and remembered. He watched the way the blacksmith's daughter whispered to the butcher's boy. He learned the names of herbs from the old woman everyone called a witch. He drew pictures in the dirt of saints with twisted legs and crooked smiles. People started to notice, not fondly, not yet, but enough to wonder. One evening, during Mass, he stood. His small frame shook. His crutch, nothing more than a carved branch, thudded against the stone floor. He recited from memory a psalm the priest had butchered. The church went still, then murmurs, then laughter, nervous, then cruel. The priest flushed, but he said nothing, because part of him knew. The boy had been right, and it made him afraid. Throughout the early Middle Ages, those with visible disabilities hovered between scorn and sanctity. To the illiterate masses, shaped more by sermons than science, a deformed body often meant a deformed soul, but not always. Sometimes, it meant proximity to the divine. In France, pilgrims flocked to a girl born without arms who claimed visions of Mary. In Italy, a blind monk was said to predict storms by the smell of the wind. People believed, and they didn't. They hoped, and they feared. Faith was a coin, Belief on one side, superstition on the other. And people flipped it daily. As for our boy, let us call him Merrick, he continued. Not just to survive, but to speak. By 15, he had become a fixture at the village gatherings, not for his strength, but for his stories. He told them of a world where crippled knights rode dream horses through golden fields, where the deaf could hear angels. Where broken bodies were not cursed, but crowned. And though they scoffed, they kept coming back, because in his words, they heard themselves. In a time where few could read, and fewer still could imagine, Marek's voice became a scripture of its own. But not everyone was pleased. One night, the local reeve, a man whose power rested on control, accused Marek of witchcraft. But he knows things he shouldn't, he said. Speaks in tongues, draws symbols, makes women weep. There was no trial, only a whisper, and then a torch. They came for him in the fog. Dragged him from his hut. But when they reached the square, something strange happened. The blacksmith's daughter stepped forward, then the old herb woman, then the priest, and slowly the crowd dissolved. Because Marek had done something rare in those times. He had been seen, truly seen. And though he had no sword, no coin, no lineage, he had changed something. In a world that barely remembered its own yesterday, his name and his limp would be remembered long after stronger men were forgotten. So ask yourself, who decides worth, the ones who build walls or the ones who tell the stories of what's inside them? Sleep now, traveler, for we have only just begun. The world did not change for Marek. Not truly. The mud was still mud. The winters still bit through bone like teeth, but something in the village air had shifted, subtly, like the first breath of spring after months of frost. People nodded to him now. Children watched him with curiosity, not fear. He hadn't become a hero. This was not that kind of world. But neither was he invisible. In the broader world, however, Marek's story was the exception. For most disabled souls of the medieval age, life unfolded in shadows, far from the firelight of memory. Their names have been lost, their stories unspoken. But the signs of their presence remained, faint carvings in cathedral corners, letters from abbots to bishops, records of alms and charity given. And hidden between these lines, you find them, people who lived half-lives in full silence. There was a time, not far from Marek's own, in a bustling city near the Danube, where a woman named Elżbieta was kept inside a convent wall. She had no legs below the knees. No one knew why. She never said. Her father had once been a minor noble, proud, devout, and ashamed. Rather than allow her to be seen, to beg, to crawl, to be mocked in the market, he gave her to the sisters at St. Odilia's when she was just 10. I give her to God, he said. Perhaps he knows what to do with her. And with that, she was left, not adopted, not embraced, simply left. Elżbieta grew up within stone and silence. The convent was not cruel, not in the way the outside world could be, but it was indifferent. To many of the nuns, she was a holy burden, a symbol of Christian patience. To others, a chore. She was taught to read. To stitch. To copy scripture with hands that trembled in the cold. But she was not taught to hope. And yet, she did. In secret, she sketched visions. On scraps of parchment, she drew great arches of fire and winged women hovering over wounded peasants. She dreamed of a world where the broken were angels, not fallen, but risen, their scars glowing like gold beneath their skin. One day, her drawings were discovered. The abbess summoned her. Elżbieta was certain she would be punished, perhaps exiled. Instead, or worse, the abbess said nothing, only stared. For a long time, then finally whispered, "Did he show you these?" Elżbieta could have lied. She could have claimed it was divine. But she did in single quotes no, she said. I made them, myself. There was a pause. Then the abbess wept. It was the first time Elżbieta saw anyone cry for her. Not out of pity, but awe. The convent began to change. Her drawings were copied, bound, whispered about. Pilgrims came to see them. Some believed she had visions, others called it madness or a miracle, but none could deny the truth. In a world where disabled bodies were seen as empty vessels, Elżbieta had filled hers with flame. Still, she never left the convent, not once. She died within those walls, but her drawings survived. Annie, in particular, now rests in the archives of a forgotten cathedral, a stained page depicting a one-winged angel, kneeling in the snow, arms outstretched as if to fly. No one knows her name anymore. The ink has faded, but the image lingers. And isn't that what remembrance truly is, not names carved in marble, but echoes that reach us in the dark, outside the cloisters? However, most disabled people lived on the streets. In towns like York, Prague, Cordoba, you could find them in alleyways and near the church doors, begging, singing, some pulling carts with twisted limbs or leaning on wooden crutches that cracked with age. Beggars were everywhere, but disabled beggars. They were a paradox, feared and pitied, blamed for their afflictions, but also seen as opportunities for salvation. Giving a coin to a crippled man might buy you favor with God. Turning away could be a sin. So the people gave, sometimes out of kindness, often out of fear, but kindness, in those days, was not dignity, and survival was not the same as living. There was a man in London, they say, though his name has vanished, who sang every morning outside St. Dunstan's. He had no hands. Both gone, possibly from frostbite, possibly punishment. No one asked. He had a voice like warm cider, thick, mellow, strange. His songs were not hymns, nor chants. They were about the river, about boats, about wind and wine and a woman he once loved. Children adored him. Adults less so. They said he was mocking scripture, that his voice led people away from piety, but secretly, many came to hear him. Then one day, he stopped. Gone. Nobody was found. No farewell, just silence. But that silence, it was louder than his songs. And for weeks, people left coins where he once sat, a handful of flowers, a half-burned candle. Because sometimes, a missing present speaks louder than 1,000 sermons. The Middle Ages were not gentle. And yet, even within the harshest winters of history, moments of warmth survived. A loaf shared, a whispered word. But make no mistake, these were not tales of triumph. They were not stories with neat endings. They were stories of endurance. To be disabled in medieval Europe was to wake each day in a world not made for you, and still choose to breathe. To speak. To create. And when the world did not listen, to wait. Because somewhere, somehow, the fire has dimmed. Would find you, but it hasn't gone out. You're still here. Still listening. And that matters. There's something sacred in the act of remembering, not with parades or monuments, but with quiet, with breath, with presence. So settle in deeper now. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let your mind drift just wide enough to see the past rising behind your closed eyes. For tonight, we go further, deeper into the soil of forgotten lives, where the broken were not mended, but endured anyway. Let me tell you of Brother Tomas. He lived in a monastery carved into the cliffs of northern Spain, a place of stone and silence, where the wind howled prayers no one wrote down. Tomas was born with a stutter so severe he could barely get through a sentence. Not in the way of nervous children. This was a full tethering of the tongue, a war with every vowel. His father had been a nobleman, briefly. Then a debtor. Then, gone. And so the boy was left at the monastery's gate, like an offering, or a burden. He grew up among monks who took vows of silence. Odd, perhaps, that a boy who could not speak was raised by men who would not, but there was a strange poetry in that. And a deeper mercy. Tomas learned it through observation. Through ink, through copying the holy text by candlelight until the calluses on his fingers cracked and bled. He became a scribe, but not just any scribe. He had a hand that moved like water, flowing, elegant, alive, and he wrote not with obedience, but with yearning. One winter, the abbot found him alone in the chapel, copying the book of Job, not once, but again and again, over and over, hundreds of pages. Same passage. He didn't ask why. Perhaps he already knew. To Tomas, Job, the man afflicted, tested, silenced, was not a metaphor. He was kin. The monastery began to send his work beyond the mountains. His illuminations, brilliant golds and deep sapphires, caught the eye of a bishop in Toulouse, then a cardinal in Rome, and so his name, Tomas the Mute, traveled farther than his feet ever would. But fame did not matter to him. What mattered was the page. It listened. Where others hadn't. It did not laugh. It did not rush him. And so he spoke, in ink. But even that could not protect him from the world beyond the walls. For in 1267, a visiting noble, a man of great wealth and very little soul, arrived at the monastery seeking a scribe to chronicle his family lineage. When he saw Tomas and learned of his speech, he scoffed. A man who cannot speak should not be entrusted with words, he said. The abbot bristled, but Tomas only bowed his head. And that night, without fanfare, he copied Psalm 39 in full. I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. He left it on the no signature pillow, just gold leaf and silence. The man left the next morning without a word. Tomas never knew if he read it. But somehow, he felt lighter. There's something unspoken in this, isn't there? How the world is so loud, and yet, the most powerful voices often whisper. Not long after, Tomas began to lose his sight. The candles, the cold. The years bent over ink and vellum had taken their toll. He did not cry. He did not rage. He simply trained a younger monk, a boy with shaking hands and poor grammar, to take his place. And then, he stopped writing, but not living. He sat in the courtyard, every morning, face tilted to the sun, like a blind sunflower. And when novices passed by, nervous and unsure, he would nod gently. Sometimes he'd hum, tuneless, soft, like a lullaby he barely remembered. He was not a miracle. He was not a saint. But he had been a voice. In a world that believed only the loud deserved to be heard. He whispered back. Elsewhere, beyond the quiet cloisters and candlelit scripture halls, the disabled poor continued to navigate the rough edges of the world. There was no mercy in the streets of Paris or Florence or Krakow. No shelter for the bent spine. No peace for the shivering limb. And yet, there are records, brief, brutal, breathtaking, of a woman known only as the Spider. She lived under the bridges of the Seine, legs so twisted she could not stand, let alone walk. But her hands. Oh, her hands. She made lace. Intricate, ethereal, impossibly fine. Merchants came from leagues away to purchase her patterns, designs so delicate they seemed like frost woven into thread. No one ever saw her face. She veiled it, always. Some said she was hideous. Others claimed she was beautiful and cursed. But the truth was simpler. She didn't want their eyes, only their coin. She saved every penny. And when she died, quietly, in winter, beneath the stone belly of Pont Neuf, the city's beggars lit candles for her. They pulled their coins and paid a priest to say her name aloud, even though none knew what it truly was. Because even in a time that forgot people quickly, kindness lingered. It passed hand to hand like bread, word to word like prayer, lace to lace like a spider's gift left in the frost. So if you wonder whether the past was ever tender, know this, even in centuries where cruelty was common, some people chose to listen. To remember. To carry. And now, so do you. Sleep well, travel. You're still with me. And that means something, because the further we go, the quieter the voices become, until only echoes remain, soft, fragile, afraid of being lost again. But you're listening. So dim the lights just a little more. Wrap yourself tighter in the hush of your room, and breathe, because the past is calling once more, not loudly, but earnestly. Tonight, we travel east. To the outskirts of Vilnius. To the snow-covered hush of 14th century Lithuania. To a village that no longer appears on maps, but once held the heart of a girl named Ruta. Ruta was born under a waning moon. She came into the world in silence, her limbs limp, her breath shallow. Her mother wept, thinking her gone, but then a sigh, a cough, a life. She did not walk, not ever. Her legs were twisted beneath her from birth, fragile, narrow things, useless by the world's measure. But Ruta was not useless. She listened. To everything. She heard the crackle of frost beneath deer hooves long before hunters noticed. She heard the trembling in her brother's voice the night their father didn't return. She heard the wind shift before the storms. Some called her cursed. Others called her blessed, but most didn't call her anything at all. She became the girl by the hearth, always sitting, always watching. In winters, she stitched. In summers, she sang, not words, just sounds. Hums that curled through the pine trees and made the children pause. Her mother built her a chair of birch and wool. Her brother carved her walking sticks she could never use. But they loved her, quietly, fiercely. And when word came that the Teutonic Knights were riding north leaving ruin in their wake, the village panicked. Men sharpened tools, women buried coins. Children were told to hush. Ruta watched. And one night, as the smoke from the stoves rose in long, worried trails, she had a dream. A black horse, a burning tree, a woman in white holding out a candle, melting, dripping, pleading. She awoke in tears. And for the first time in her life, she spoke. They'll come before the moon breaks, she whispered. No one listened. Why would they? But the next day, before the sun even touched the frost, the forest erupted with hooves. and the nights came. The village was not destroyed. Not fully. Some hid. Some begged. Some fought and were cut down. But when it was over, people remembered Ruda's words, and something shifted. They came to her now, not with offerings or pity, but with questions. Where would the rains fall? Would the harvest be thin? Would the wolves come early? She never claimed to know. She only listened. But often, she was right. And for the first time, her life was hers. Years passed. Her hair silvered. She never left her home. Never married. Never touched the forest floor. But people came. And when she finally passed, in her sleep, beneath a wool blanket her mother had once sewn, they called her the seated prophetess. They built a cairn for her of river stones. And for decades, women left herbs and ribbons there, hoping to hear what she once heard. Ruda left nothing behind. No books, no scrolls, no ink, but she left memory. And in a time where lives like hers vanished into the silence, that was everything. Further south, across the winding roads of the Alps, in a monastery nestled like a secret between two crags of granite, there lived a boy who never grew. Luca. He was born small, painfully so. His arms were stunted. His spine curled like a branch beneath too much snow. His family left him at the monastery door during a thunderstorm. The monks found him wrapped in cloth embroidered with ivy. He should not have lived, but he did. He had no strength in his legs. No reach in his hands. And yet, he had eyes like flint and fire. He read by candlelight, faster than any scribe. And he remembered. Everything. He could recite scripture after hearing it once. He could memorize maps. He could recall what Brother Anselm had muttered under his breath 3 winters past. They kept him inside, not out of cruelty, but fragility. The world was not safe for someone like Luca, but the walls of the monastery. They bent around him. He was tutored in Latin, astronomy, alchemy. He could not mix the elements himself, but he guided others' dictated formulas. And once, when the abbot fell ill, it was Luca who whispered the cure, a brew of ash leaf and goat's milk. People began to visit from outside. They called him the mind without a body. Some said he was possessed. Others, that he was a vessel for angels. But Luca cared little for titles. He only wanted knowledge. And peace. In his 22nd year, a scholar from Prague arrived, curious, skeptical. He tested Luca with riddles, histories, equations. And by the end of 3 days, he wept. Why hide this light? He asked the monks. He should be shown to kings. But Luca only smiled. He said, books remember. When he died, too soon, too small, his only request was that no stone mark his grave. Let the mind return to the wind, he whispered. Let the body feed the earth. And so they buried him beneath a wild oak, and planted books in the soil around him. For years, pages would rise from that place, blown loose by time. Notes in Luca's hand. Thoughts unfinished. Ideas eternal. And those who read them, changed. What does it mean, then, to be remembered? Is it a statue, a hymn, a name carved in stone? Or is it a whisper in the roots? A story told by candlelight, a moment, like this one. You're still here, that's good. And so are they, because what we speak of tonight is not told loudly. It's carried like an ember, hidden in the hand, passed between hearts. Never written in books. This next story was almost lost, not because it wasn't important, but because no one thought it was. Until now. Picture it. A wooden shack on the edge of a moor, far from the warmth of cities, thatch roof sagging with age, moss creeping up the stones like time made visible, and inside, a girl named Elswith. She was born during a thunderstorm, her mother said. The midwife had left hours earlier, terrified by the child's twisted body, one arm shorter than the other, back bowed like a willow after rain, and eyes that didn't track the world quite right. Witchburn, the village whispered. They always whispered. Her mother heard them, but she didn't leave. She raised Elswith the way the moor raises heather, slowly, stubbornly, with love that does not bloom in the open but takes root where no one dares look. Elswith couldn't walk far. Her legs were crooked, her steps uneven. But she had her hands, and she had her ears. She listened to the moor. And the moor spoke back. It told her when the frost would come early, when the foxes would bear kits, when the hemlock would bloom. She learned to speak to birds, not with words, but still, they listened. Crows came first, then sparrows, and once even an owl, who watched her for an hour in silence before vanishing into the fog. She carved small charms out of bone and bogwood. Not for money, for healing. A charm for sleep, a charm for fevers, A charm for mothers who feared their wombs had turned cold. At first, no one came. But then, someone did. A woman, desperate, with a child burning from within. ELSWYTH gave her a charm wrapped in moss and whispered, "Put this beneath his tongue. Let the earth remember him." The fever broke. Word spread. And slowly, they came. One by one. Never during the day. Always in the hush of dusk or the stillness before dawn. ELSWYTH never left them more. But the world found her anyway. She was 17 when the priest came. Not to seek help, to seek control. He brought scripture and suspicion. Called her tricks blasphemy. Called her body a punishment. Said her gifts were the devil's bait, temptation sown into twisted flesh. But he was old and afraid. And she was not. She stood, trembling but tall, and she said, "God made the lily and the leeches. If he meant for one to cure the other, is it not still divine?" He said nothing. He left. And after that, no one challenged her again. But she didn't become powerful. She didn't seek followers. She didn't wear robes or crowns. She simply endured, season after season, as the world changed around her. She grew herbs. She buried birds who had no nests. She spoke to the wind like it was her sister. And when she died, in her sleep, at 81, the entire village walked to her door. They didn't know why. They just felt it. No church bells. No rites. But the moor hummed with a kind of mourning, low, ancient, endless. They say wild flowers grew over her doorstep. In winter. And that's how you know that the earth remembers, even when people forget. Far away, in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, another story unfolded. This one, quieter still. It belongs to a boy with no name, not truly. He was called the Ghost, the Nothing, the Wait. He was born in a peasant camp during a brutal winter. The midwives said he would not survive. He had no voice, no movement below the waist, and eyes clouded like river ice. His mother died in childbirth. His father walked away. And so, he was left in the hay, barely swaddled. But a woman, a washer, no one important, took him in. She never gave him a proper name, only called him my star, in whispered polish. And somehow, he survived. He never spoke, never stood, but he smiled. Oh, how he smiled. And when the children came to play by the well, he would sit nearby in a basket of reeds, giggling, eyes following shadows on the walls. He had no voice, but when he was there, no one fought. No one cried. He calmed them, simply by being. The village began to notice. Mothers would sit beside him, their babies restless, until peace returned. Elders would hold his hand when the pain in their bones grew too sharp. They said his touch was like snow that didn't melt. Soft. Still. Eternal. He died young. Maybe 7. Maybe 10. No one knew for sure. There was no grave. But for years after, children in that village would leave wild daisies by the well. And if someone felt sorrow too heavy to bear, they'd sit in silence beside the reeds and whisper, "Star, stay with me a while." And the wind would still, and the trees would hush. And somehow, they'd go on, because sometimes the miracle is that they existed at all. These are not tales of glory, not triumphs carved in marble. They are quiet truths, folded into the corners of history. But they are real. And they matter. As you drift deeper into this night, remember, good, let your room fall darker. Let the hum of the world around you grow dimmer. There's something sacred about this moment, you, wrapped in the stillness of now. And the past, unfolding like smoke from a dying candle. Tonight, we travel west. To the fractured stone walls and wine-scoured fields of 12th century Brittany, a land of salt and shadow, where the sea comes closer every year and the sky never quite forgets how to grieve. And there, in a crumbling coastal monastery, lived Brother Etienne. He was not born a brother. He was born broken. His jaw never closed fully, dislocated by birth, some said. His spine curved like an old man's. He drooled as a child. He couldn't chew. He could barely hold a spoon. When he tried to speak, the words collapsed into sound, guttural, raw, painful to hear. His family kept him in the cellar. Not out of cruelty, but shame. They feared the whispers, feared the priest, feared the villagers who made the sign of the cross when he passed. They fed him in silence, washed him in darkness. He learned early that love can be quiet and still wounding. But he listened. To footsteps. To birds nesting in the walls. To the way dust moved through beams of light. And then, when he was 10, a miracle, or something like it, a visiting monk heard Etienne crying in the cellar. Not words, just music. Wordless, trembling sound that rose like incense. And it stopped the monk in his tracks. He asked to meet the boy. They refused. He insisted. And when he finally stood before Etienne, he didn't recoil. He knelt. Because Etienne's voice, in pain, in song, carried something raw and unfiltered. It wasn't beauty. It was truth. The monk brought him to the monastery. No promises, no prayers. Just a space. Etienne didn't speak in sermons. He spoke through sound. He learned to write, slowly, with one hand that trembled like a leaf. But it was enough. He began transcribing music. Not just copying composing. Not with rules, but with feeling. He used symbols no one else understood. He described the sound of grief as a note that refuses to end. He called joy the silence between two storms. The brothers didn't know what to make of him, but they knew he mattered. And over time, the curious came. A woman from Toulouse, seeking to hear her dead husband's favorite hymn again. A blind boy, whom Etienne taught to feel pitch in the bones. Even nobles, cloaked and secretive, came to hear him hum beneath the altar, where his songs echoed like prayers that had forgotten how to ask for anything. He never became famous. He never left the monastery. He never healed. But he built a chapel from sound. And in that chapel, every soul was equal. They said he died with a smile, face tilted to the sky, listening to a choir only he could hear. And when they buried him, they found parchment beneath his bed. Notes scrawled in uneven lines, lyrics written in the margins. If God made me wrong, then why does the wind weep when I sing? And no one could answer. But they sang his music
far beyond
for 100
Brittany,
years, in the frostbitten reach of northern Norway. Another voice once stirred the dark, not in song, but in silence. Her name was Inga, a reindeer herder's daughter, born in a world of endless snow and sharp, hungry stars. She was deaf. From birth. The others called her Den Stum, the silent one. They thought she was slow. Empty. Unreachable. They were wrong. Inga saw what others missed. She watched the animals, their breath, their posture, the language of fur and antler. She could predict when a herd would split, when the wolves would come, when the ice would crack beneath the sleds. Her father didn't understand her, not really. But he trusted her, because every time he ignored her gestures, something went wrong. At first, the elders mocked it. A girl who spoke with her hands. But after 3 winters of safe travel, after the avalanche she warned of, they began to follow her signs. She invented a language. Not letters. Movements. The twitch of a finger, the angle of a wrist, the circle of a palm. She taught it to her sister. Then to the children. And soon, the village had 2 languages. One for sound, one for sight. Inga became the memory keeper. She couldn't hear the stories told at the fire, but she watched the faces, the mouths, the gestures. And she told them back with her hands, like dance, like flame. They called her the snow teller. When she passed quietly, alone, as snow began to fall, the children gathered and danced her stories in the drifts. And still, to this day, some in the north sign her name with reverence. A hand held over the heart, a circle in the air, a finger to the stars. Because Inga taught them this, that silence is not the absence of voice, but the presence of a deeper way to listen. So, what have we learned? That value was never in the shape of the body, nor the strength of the spine, nor the clarity of speech. It was, and is, in the echoes they left behind. Those echoes are still with us. In music. In movement. In stories.
You're still here.
Good. You've listened this far, and now the night has drawn you deeper still, into the quiet places of history, the shadows beneath the grand tapestries, where forgotten lives press gently against the seams of time. Let the world fall silent around you. Let your thoughts soften like old pages in a book. There's a story waiting in the dark, and it's time we listen. Tonight, we walk the halls of a medieval hospital. Not the sterile, white-walled sanctuaries but stone corridors echoing with prayers and pain. An institution more chapel than clinic, a place where sickness met salvation, or so they said. This one stood in the heart of Cologne, nestled behind cloisters and beneath stained glass. The air was thick with incense and boiled herbs, and among the cots and the coughing lived a boy named Matthews. He was no more than 9 when he was brought in. Thin. Fevered. Twisted with a palsy that locked one side of his body in spasm. His mouth hung open. His limbs trembled as though a storm lived beneath his skin. His mother, too poor to pay the alms, left him at the steps of the Domus Dei, house of God. She kissed his forehead, whispered a psalm through tears, and walked away before she could change her mind. They took him in, not out of mercy, but obligation. The church taught that care for the broken was a ladder to heaven, a way to scrub one's sins clean through service to those who could not serve themselves. But Matthews didn't ask for pity. He asked for ink. He couldn't speak, not clearly, but his hands could still move. And the monks noticed something strange. When Matthews was given chalk, he drew, not childish scrawls, but shapes precise, almost holy. He copied the curvature of the Gothic arches. He sketched the spines of snails, the spiral of candle smoke, the folds of a monk's sleeve. By 12, he was illustrating manuscripts. A miracle, they said. A mute boy with trembling limbs illuminating gospels with gold leaf and lapis dust. He was not taught Latin, but he learned to read by watching lips move. He mimicked the rhythm of the monks' prayers, traced the margins of their books with his fingers. He became their ghost, their hidden hand. No one outside the abbey knew his name, but dozens of sacred texts bore his mark, a small crescent moon, hidden in corners, peeking from beneath a saint's robe or behind a tree. They say he drew angels with crooked wings, not broken, just different. As if to say, not all holiness is symmetrical. When he died, the brothers did not weep. Not out of coldness, but reverence. They believed his soul had already risen years ago, carried upward in ink and parchment, and they buried him not in the pauper's field, but beneath the scriptoriu. So that every word written above him might echo his name, not aloud, but through lines and letters, the language he gave the world when his voice could not. And across the channel, in the murky boglands of East Anglia, another child was being written out of history. A girl, a changeling, they whispered. She was born silent. Eyes wide, fingers that fluttered constantly, like she was trying to touch music no one else could hear. Her name was Isolde. She didn't cry as a baby, didn't speak at 3, didn't look people in the eyes. Her father believed she was fetched. Her mother prayed harder. When she was 5, she wandered into the woods during a storm and wasn't found for 2 days. When they did find her, she was dry, wrapped in leaves and humming. That was when the priest began watching her more closely. He didn't understand her, so he feared her. He told the villagers she must be watched, that she was dangerous. Not for what she did, but for what she didn't do. She didn't laugh. She didn't scream. She simply was. They tried to teach her letters. She rearranged them. They tried to teach her chores. She forgot, but when she found a broken bird, she sat beside it for hours, humming until it flew again. When she found a blind lamb, she led it through the field, hand resting gently on its head. One day, she took a candle and melted it over the altar, not to defile it, but to draw shapes in wax. Patterns of stars and flowers and waves. The priest beat her, but she came back the next day and did it again. Some said she was simple. Others said she was touched by something greater. She never married, never left the village, but in time, the children came to her. Not for lessons, just to sit. To be quiet together. And when they wept, she held their hands, and they stopped. No spells. No sermons, just stillness. When she died, without warning, without ceremony, the village changed. Children left small wax drawings on her grave. Spirals. Moons. Unfinished suns. And in time, even the priest stopped preaching hellfire and began to speak of mystery, because Isolde had shown them what grace looked like in silence. 2 souls, one with trembling hands, shaping God in gold. Another with stillness, shaping love in wax and wonder. They left no lineage. No heirs. No statues, but they mattered. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? You're still listening, still drifting with us through the worn and weathered halls of time. If you're lying down, adjust your blanket. Turn your face toward the cool side of the pillow. Let the last distractions fall away, like ash from an ancient fire, because tonight we enter the realm of royalty, but not the kind draped in silk or seated on golden thrones. No, this is a different kind of sovereign, a prince not of power, but of pain. They called him Casimir. Born in Krakow in the early 14th century, the 3rd son of a minor Polish duke, never meant to rule, never meant to lead, but fate has its strange affections. From infancy, Casimir's body betrayed him. His legs bowed outward, his spine coiled like a serpent, and his skin, pale as parchment, bruised with the lightest touch. He could not stand without help, could not ride, or wield a sword, or dance in the courtly halls. To the nobles, he was pitiable, a sad adornment in velvet. To his brothers, he was an embarrassment, kept in the background during feasts, hidden during processions. But Casimir was not a fool. He watched. He listened. And what he lacked in muscle, he gathered in mind. From the floor of the library, propped on cushions, he consumed knowledge faster than the monks could supply it. Latin, Greek, astronomy, law, scripture. He memorized entire treatises, corrected his tutors, predicted political uprisings with the clarity of someone who had always been forced to live outside the storm. His father dismissed him. His siblings laughed behind their goblets. But one by one, they died. Wars. Hunting accidents. Fever. And at the age of 27, Casimir, hunched, frail, barely able to lift a cup, became heir. His coronation was quiet, not because the people didn't care, but because they weren't sure how to feel. A crippled king, a monarch who could not mount a horse. A man who limped when he walked and slurred when he spoke. But then came the famine. And Casimir acted. He emptied the grain stores. Sent monks door to door to feed the poorest. Refused feasts in the palace until every common child had bread. Then came a war. And Casimir, too weak for battle, outmaneuvered his enemies with treaties and misdirection. He bribed generals, wrote false letters, convinced entire garrisons to surrender before a blade was ever drawn. And Casimir opened the castle to the dying. His own chambers were turned into a sick ward. He walked painfully, slowly, from bed to bed, touched sores with his bare hands, whispered prayers even as his own lungs began to wheeze. He survived, and the people began to love him, not because he was powerful, but because he was present. They called him the quiet king, the crooked saint. Some even believed his deformities were divine, that God had bent his body to remind the world of humility. When he died, at just 39, tens of thousands lined the streets. Farmers, priests, beggars. They carried candles, not swords, laid wreaths, not coins. And centuries later, in the ruins of the old palace, someone found a letter, tucked inside a hollow brick, signed in a trembling hand. If I was made low, it was only so I could see the ones the highborn never notice. If I ruled poorly, then why did the hungry call me father? Casimir's bones are long gone, but the memory still walks through Krakow. Sometimes seen at dusk, a bent figure by the market gates, offering bread no one can touch, from royalty to rags, because not all histories wear crowns. In the slums of Valencia, around the same time Casimir ruled, a girl named Pilar stitched fabric by candlelight. She was born with only one hand. The right arm ended just past the elbow, smooth, small, like it had never finished its thought. She was mocked. Ignored. Told she'd never marry, never sew, never contribute. But she learned quickly, not with two hands, but with one foot and one miracle of a left hand. She embroidered with precision, not grand tapestries, but tiny symbols, talismans, eyes. Knots. Stars. People began to whisper that her work warded off disease, that her thread sealed wounds, that her patterns brought dreams. Pilar became the seamstress of the forgotten, for the poor, for widows, for plague orphans too scared to sleep. She gave them cloth stitched with quiet spells, not written, not chanted, just sewn, with care no one had ever shown her. She spoke little, but her eyes saw everything. When a soldier tried to take her work without paying, she didn't argue. She just stitched a cursed sigil into his hem. 3 nights later, he fled the city, raving, hallucinating birds made of thread and teeth. Whether the story is true or not, no one ever stole from her again. She died quietly. In a shared room. Her final piece, a swaddling cloth for a stillborn child, and stitched into the border. In tiny letters, even broken needles can weave warmth. Even one hand can hold the world. The cloth was passed from mother to mother for generations. They say it never frayed. And somewhere in Spain, folded in an heirloom chest, it waits. Still. Casimir, Pilar, a king who walked crooked, a girl who stitched with ghosts. Both left behind more than bones. They left behind proof that weakness is a word invented by the comfortable. That worth is not measured in muscle. You're still here, memory, still listening, still traveling with us through the soft shadows of the forgotten. Let your breath grow slower. Let your hands grow still. Let your thoughts unravel like ancient ribbon, loose, delicate, falling gently into the past. Because where we're going next, it's colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit. We find ourselves in the frostbitten silence of 12th century Iceland, a land carved by fire and ice, where mountains split the clouds and the sea devours the sun. And here, in a village flanked by basalt cliffs, lived a boy named Leif. Leif the Silent, they called him. Leif the crooked-mouthed life, whose words never quite came out right. He had what we now call a speech disorder. But back then there was no name, only suspicion, only shame. His words stumbled. Twisted came out half-formed, like fish pulled too early from the sea. And so he stopped trying. Children mocked him. Men ignored him. Women pitied him. He spent most days alone, not out of choice, but out of exhaustion, because every sentence was a battle. Every thought that tried to leave his lips was caught in a net woven by fear. But Leaf had hands, strong, nimble hands, and those hands learned to carve. He began with driftwood, hunks of gray, sea-tossed pine. He shaped birds, then wolves. Then gods. At night he whispered to his wooden creations the words he could never say aloud. And something strange began to happen. People started to listen. They came to see his carvings, not just because they were beautiful, but because they told stories. Stories of sorrow, of longing, of fury and frost and quiet grace. He carved a scene of a mother losing her child to winter, and the entire village wept. He carved a figure with his own crooked mouth, seated beside Odin, and the elders took notice. They offered him a place in the annual thing, the Great Council, not to speak, but to show. Leaf's carvings became the voice of the voiceless. His hands translated what his mouth could not. One year, during a harsh winter, he carved a child curled against a bear, warmth in the middle of danger. People saw it, and began sharing their food. He never spoke during the meetings. His sculpture said enough, never needed to. He lived to be old, never married, never raised a voice. But when he died, the village carved his image beside the gods on the stones near the fjord. Not for what he said, but for what he helped others feel. And in the ruins of that village, beneath layers of ash and soil, one of his carvings still survives, a small piece of driftwood, shaped like a boy with his hand on his throat, and a bird resting on his shoulder. No words, just the story. Thousands of miles away, and centuries later, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, another child struggled with words. Her name was Aslihan, but she preferred Asli. She was born deaf. And in a palace world built entirely on whispers that made her invisible. Her family, nobles of mid-level standing, tried to hide her, tried to teach her to lip-read, to speak, to pass. But Asli refused. She found language elsewhere. In movement. In gesture. In rhythm. They brought in dancers to entertain the harem. Asli memorized their steps, not to mimic, but to speak. She developed her own form of storytelling, a fusion of dance and silent sign, not the formal dances of court, but something raw, improvised, emotional. She would perform, alone, in the gardens, and the servants, the only ones who watched without judgment, began to imitate her. Then to follow her. Then to learn from her. What began as expression became instruction. She invented signs for love, for hunger, for grief, for laughter. The palace guards began using them. So did cooks. So did children. The nobles didn't notice at first. Then they feared it, a language they could not hear, a revolution that whispered instead of shouted. They tried to stop her. She danced anyway. One day, the Sultan's youngest daughter, born mute, ran away from her lessons and found Asli. And when they returned, hand in hand, signing to each other with radiant clarity, the palace fell silent. Aslihan was summoned. And instead of punishment, she was asked to teach. For the rest of her days, she did. Not just in the palace. In schools. In markets. In the deaf community that had always existed. Unseen, behind the veil of sound. She died quietly, with no titles, no heirs. But in Istanbul today, there is a statue of a girl with her hands mid-motion, eyes open, feet poised in a half-dash step. No plaque. No name. But those who know. No. She changed a world that never thought to listen. Leaf. Asli. The boy who carved silence. The girl who danced it into meaning. They remind us that the world does not belong only to the loud. That power is not always in voice, but in presence. And that silence, when chosen, can be the loudest story. You're still here. Now still rest. Traveling with us. Still breathing in the soft air of long-buried truths. Let yourself sink just a little deeper, not into sleep, but into awareness. Because some stories, they don't knock before entering. They arrive quietly and sit beside you. This one comes from the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, from a small Benedictine abbey nestled between forest and river in the early 1300s. And in that abbey, behind thick stone walls, a girl was born who would never walk. Her name was Mechthild. They called her the Still One, a delicate infant with legs that refused to move, and a spine that twisted too soon. Her parents, minor nobility, saw her as a burden. a child who would never marry, never work. Never fight. So they gave her to the church. It wasn't uncommon for girls deemed unfit for the world beyond the cloister. The convent was considered mercy, but Mechthild, she didn't see it that way. To her, the convent was not exile. It was freedom. She couldn't run, but she could read. She couldn't kneel, but she could pray. And in her small cell, with its single window facing east, she began to write. At first, she copied scripture, then sermons, then visions, because Mechthild saw things. In her silence, in her solitude, she claimed to see angels, not the shining ones of gold and song, but fractured, weeping angels, whose wings had been burned and broken by the weight of humanity's sins. She wrote of them in the margins of psalms, desperate, passionate sketches of divine suffering. She called them the Watchers. The other nuns were frightened. The abbess warned her. Said the church did not look kindly on such imagination. But Mechthild kept writing. She described heaven as not a place of glory, but of longing. She described God not as a king, but as a wound. Her words were wild. Unruly. Blasphemous. Some said. But they moved people. Pilgrims came, not for healing, not for relics, but to hear the still girl speak of angels who mourned for the living. And one day, a monk brought her writings to a bishop, and the bishop brought them to Rome. And Rome fell silent, because what they read was not heresy. It was heartbreak. It was truth dressed in metaphor. It was pain made holy. Mechthild was summoned. She was asked to recant. To say it was fantasy, illness, imagination. She looked them in the eye and said, "If my suffering makes me closer to God, then leave me to my pain." They exiled her, not to punishment, but to obscurity. She was sent to a poorer convent, farther from the city, deeper into the woods, and there, in the quiet cold, she kept writing. She wrote until her hands gave out, until her eyes blurred, until the ink froze in its well. When she died, she was barely 40. But her words, her visions, they survived, hidden in footnotes, smuggled into sermons, passed from noon to noon like contraband scripture. Today, fragments of her work remain. Fragments. But enough to remember that she lived, that she suffered, and that in her broken body she housed a universe of voices no one else dared to hear. And across the sea, in a far different world, another girl listened to the voice within her. Her name was Ailsa, born in the Scottish Highlands. Mid-14th century, a time of war, of famine, of fire. She was born with one arm, not injured, not removed, just never there. Her mother wept. Her father drank. The midwife whispered that such children did not live long. But Ailsa lived. She grew. She chopped wood with one hand. She washed clothes with one hand. She learned to hunt, not with bow or blade, but with cunning. She learned the paths of animals, the sounds of foxes and deer, the shift in wind before a storm. She became a tracker. Her village called her strange. She wore no dresses, spoke few words, carried the jawbone of a sheep tied to her belt, her only weapon. But when winter came and others starved, Ailsa brought food. When wolves circled, it was she who drove them off. When the English burned the crops, it was she who led the survivors through the glen. She never sought praise. She never asked to belong. She simply was, alive. Unafraid. And utterly her own. One spring, when the snow melted late, they found her sleeping beneath the roots of a hawthorn tree, her jawbone stained with blood, and a fox curled against her side. The villagers built her a home, not out of pity, but reverence. They stopped calling her strange. They called her wise. Ailsa the one-armed, Ailsa the hunter, Ailsa whose path no one could predict. She lived to an old age, and when she died, they say the hawthorn tree bloomed with red blossoms for the first time in memory. To women, one cloistered, one wild. One who wrote, one who hunted, one who saw angels, one who ran with wolves. Both born different, both born whole in ways the world refused to see. They remind us that wholeness is not symmetry, that strength is not silence, that difference is not a flaw, but a doorway. To live with the body the world doesn't understand is to carve out a space for your own mythology. The darkness no longer feels cold. It breathes now, slow, ancient, steady, like the chest of the world rising and falling beneath your pillow. The narrator returns, not from the outside, but from somewhere closer, almost inside your thoughts. You've made it this far. That means something. The night may stretch long, but you're not alone in it. You're walking beside those who came before, step by step, story by story, life by quiet, unspoken life. So let the hush surround you, feel the air settle on your skin. This next story is one the world almost lost. We travel now to Egypt, not the pyramids, not the pharaohs, but a smaller Egypt, 11th century, after the caliphate had fractured, and the land was caught between scholars and soldiers, sun and silence. In the dusty alleys of Fustat, now swallowed by Cairo, lived a boy named Yusuf. He was born with a twisted spine and a body that struggled to grow. He was short, very short, and thin, almost painfully so. His mother said he had the bones of a bird, fragile and holy. His father, a leather worker, never said much at all, just watched him, warily, as if Yusuf's very being asked questions too difficult to answer. He walked with a limp and couldn't carry water. He was no help in the shop. He was not strong, not quick, not useful, but he listened. Yusuf had a gift, not of hands, not of labor, but of memory. He could hear a phrase once and recall it word for word. He could sit beside scholars in the mosque and echo back entire teachings like a mirror made of thought. At 12, he wandered into the marketplace, where a blind poet sat under an awning reciting the Quran and verses of love. Yusuf stood silently for hours, absorbing every line. When the poet finally paused, Yusuf recited it all back, flawlessly. The old man wept, and from that day on, Yusuf became his companion, his scribe, his echo. He learned how to read fingers on a palm, how to guide the blind through crowds, how to speak in rhythm so that memory would never slip. But he also learned something else, that blindness and deformity were not curses. They were languages. The poet called them divine dialects, reminders that the body is just one page in a larger book. Together, they traveled, from mosque to market, from Alexandria to Aswan. Yusuf memorized the Hadith, then the Torah, then fragments of Greek philosophy copied into Arabic script. He became a walking library, not just of holy text, but of grief. He carried poems of mothers who'd lost children, laments of slaves, verses of longing from Persian mystics, wisdoms whispered in secret from women who couldn't speak aloud in public. He never published, never wrote his name at the top of anything. But for decades, scribes and scholars sat before him and asked, Yusuf, do you remember the line about mercy in the second scroll? Yusuf, do you recall the poem of the widow who sings to the sea? And he always answered, until one day, he didn't. He fell ill, quickly and quietly. The poet, now ancient, held his hand until his last breath. And when Yusuf was buried, wrapped in simple linen beneath the desert's edge, there were no books in his grave. But hundreds of pages had passed through his voice. And in one corner of an old madrasa in Cairo, etched faintly into the wall, someone carved a single line. He remembered what we forgot, and so we remember him. And across continents, in a shadowed village near Kyoto, another life was unfolding, one as quiet, and just as strange. Her name was Natsuko. She was born in the 10th century, toward the end of the Heian era, in a noble family that considered beauty a kind of courtesy. But Natsuko did not fit their ideals. Her face was pale and marked by a birthmark that spread from her cheek to her neck, dark, mottled, unmistakable. Worse still, she had seizures, unpredictable, frightening. In a time when such things were seen as omens, or worse, spirits, her parents hid her from view. She was raised in the back rooms of the estate, allowed outside only at night. But in the dark, she found a rhythm. The cicadas, the wind in bamboo, the flicker of lantern light against shoji screens. And she began to write, not on scrolls, but on leaves, on stones, on the inside of her sleeves. Tiny poems, fragments of breath, moments the world forgot to notice. One of her poems, found pressed into a crack in the garden wall, read, "The moon does not care if I am lovely or not. It touches my face anyway." She grew older. The seizures grew worse, but her poetry grew sharper. She began to write of her seizures, not as shame, but as storms, gifts of the gods. Moments when her soul left the body and spoke with crows, with rivers, with ancestors who walked barefoot across the stars. A servant girl found one of her verses and showed it to a monk. The monk copied it, then recited it in court. And within months, whispers of Natsuko's poems spread across the capital. But no one knew her name. She never left the estate, never claimed authorship. She just kept writing. And one spring, when her mother died, she emerged, only once to attend the funeral. They say the mourners turned to stare, but she walked straight past them, her face lit not by shame, but by moonlight. She bowed at the altar, then vanished again. When she died, her family burned most of her belongings. But some poems survived, hidden in corners, sewn into robes, painted in ink behind paper walls. A few are now preserved in museums, unattributed. But a scholar, years later, noticed a pattern. Each one signed with the character for stillness, and a single dark dot beside it. Natsuko, Yusuf, two souls who carried whole libraries inside themselves, whose bodies bore what the world did not understand, whose minds refused to be silenced. They left behind no great monuments, no titles, no fame, but they left language, the language of survival, of witness, of poetry, and now, you carry them, too, so let your breath soften. You're not just listening anymore, you're remembering, and somewhere, beneath your dreams, they're remembering you. You're still with me. That says something, not about the story, about you. There's a kind of strength in stillness, a kind of courage in simply staying. So close your eyes if you haven't. Feel the quiet wrap itself around you, not like chains, but like cloth. Soft, warm, familiar. Because this next path was lonelier than most. We're going back again, to the year 1348, to a place stained with silence. Northern Italy, Pistoia, a small, walled city. A city about to break. The Black Death was coming, not as rumor anymore, not as fear on the horizon, but as breath, sour and wet, on the back of the neck. And in the shadows of that city lived a man named Tommaso. He was a gravedigger, but not by choice. Before the plague, Tommaso was a glassmaker. He had gentle hands, and poor legs, his knees bent inward, his back curved to the side. They said he walked like melted wax, slow and sure, but his glasswork was steady. He made lamps so thin you could see candlelight flicker through the colors like blood through skin. No one asked him to speak. They only asked for beauty. But then came the plague, and beauty stopped mattering. When the city's gravediggers began to die, the priests begged for help. No one came forward, except Tommaso. They laughed at first. He can barely carry a bowl, and you want him to carry corpses. But Tommaso said nothing. He just started digging. Every day, every night, through fevered sweat and frozen rain, through blisters that bled through linen, through the sound of mothers screaming into their sleeves. He dug, not because he was strong, but because he had to be. They buried thousands, sometimes 6 to a pit, sometimes 20. Tommaso began leaving glass beads in the graves, tiny ones, handmade. He said it helped them find their way. One day, someone asked why. He replied, if the body was broken, let the soul be carried in color. Let there be some light, even in the dark. When his tools broke, he used his hands. When his hands bled, he wrapped them and kept going. He buried the children first, then the mothers, then the priests, then his brother. He didn't cry. He just placed a blue bead in the boy's mouth and closed it with both trembling palms. In time, others joined him, not out of faith, out of shame. And when the plague finally loosened its grip, when the air smelled of spring instead of rot, Tommaso stood at the edge of the last grave and wept. For all he'd lost, for all he'd given, for all the silence he had carried inside. They offered him gold. He refused. They offered him a place in the city council. He refused. He returned to his workshop, picked up a shard of melted glass, and made a single lamp, not for sale, not for church, but for the graveyard. It still stands there, cracked, leaning, but glowing, especially on foggy nights. And farther north, beyond the Alps, in a damp village by the Elbe River, another soul bore the weight of sorrow. Her name was Clara. She was born with eyes that didn't move together. Some said it was strabismus. Others said it was madness. She saw the world in double, always, as if the world refused to line up. She couldn't read, not because she didn't try, but because the words floated, split, danced. So instead, she listened. She became a midwife. Not the kind with books and tools, but the kind who knew. She knew how a woman's scream changed in the final push. She knew how to hum the rhythm that calmed a breech baby. She knew which herbs slowed bleeding, and which ones sent you to sleep and never woke you again. People feared her, but they needed her. And when the cold came early, sharp, endless, and babies began to die in the womb, it was Clara who stayed. She was never fast, never elegant, but she arrived. Always. One night, a woman labored for 30 hours. No one else would help. Clara sat in silence beside her, hands on her belly, eyes flickering in different directions, as if seeing both death and life at once. The child was stillborn. The mother would not stop screaming. So Clara did something strange. She took a bowl of warm water, whispered to it, and washed the baby's body slowly, as though it were alive. Then she swaddled it in the mother's wedding shawl, and laid it beside her, one last time. Not to haunt, to honor. When the mother woke, she did not cry. She simply said. She looked like she was sleeping under moonlight. Clara left nothing behind but stories. No grave, no portrait. But in that village, for years afterward, when a baby wouldn't come, they'd whisper. Call the double-eyed one. And if you believed, she'd come. Tommaso. Clara. A man with a crooked back who gave the dead light. A woman with divided vision who helped the living see. Both lived at the edge. Both held more pain than most ever knew. Both chose to stay, not because it was easy, but because someone had to. They remind us that the most broken hands sometimes carry the heaviest gifts, that the world does not ask you to be perfect, only present. And tonight, you are. So let your eyes close. Let the stories settle into your skin. You've walked beside grief and grace. You've watched lamps burn in graveyards, and babies bathed in moonlight. And maybe, just maybe, you've begun to understand that there is no such thing as small kindness. Only quiet ones, the kind that echo, long after we're gone. Still with me, that means everything. Not every traveler makes it this far. Not everyone listens past the noise of the world. But you've stayed. So breathe. Let the night grow thicker around you. Let your muscles soften, your chest rise and fall like the tide. Because tonight's story unfolds in a place where silence was not peaceful, but forced. We go now to the sprawling cities of Mesoamerica, centuries before Columbus, to the kingdom of the Zapotecs, in the mountains of what is now Oaxaca. And there, in the dry highlands where stone steps climb toward the sky, a girl named Isel was born. She came into the world during eclipse. The midwives said her fate would walk in shadow. They weren't wrong. Isel was born with a malformed hand. Her left, curled inward, 3 fingers fused together like the bud of a flower refusing to bloom. Her people were builders, artists, warriors. Perfection was sacred. Symmetry was law. And so Isel, the crooked-handed child, was hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The priests believed physical deformities were signs of divine intervention, or divine punishment. Either way, she was set apart. They did not let her learn the sacred dances. They did not let her weave. But they could not stop her from seeing. And Isel saw everything. She watched the shadows the sun made as it passed across the carved faces of the temples. She watched the birds and learned their cries, their patterns, their meanings. She learned to mimic their calls, not with a whistle, but with her fingers against stone. She turned her hand into an instrument, and slowly, over years, she developed a language of percussion, tapping, scraping, knocking, that echoed across courtyards and steps. She could imitate rain. She could summon birds. She could send messages through the walls. People began to listen. First the servants, then the dancers, then, finally, the priests. When drought came, and the sky refused to open, the high priest asked her to perform. Not a dance, not a prayer, just her sound. She stood in the center of the sacred plaza, bared her hand, and played the stone temple like a drum. The sky cracked open the next day. Rain poured like it had been held back just for her. They began to call her Extlapuani, the listener between worlds. She was no longer hidden. She became keeper of echoes, advisor to priests, teacher to children born different. And when she died, old, smiling, her hands still curled, they carved her name into the temple wall. But not with ink, with rhythm. To this day, some say if you press your ear to those stones during the rainy season, you can still hear her drumming, still calling, still listening. Half a world away, in the crumbling edges of medieval Wales, another girl found herself locked inside a very different kind of silence. Her name was Shind. She was born in a village that no longer exists, its stones pulled up to build newer, straighter places. She was not blind, not deaf, not visibly broken, but she did not speak, not ever, not a cry as an infant, not a word as a girl, nothing. The midwives whispered that she'd been hollowed by a spirit. The priest said she was cursed, but her mother said only this: she sees the world from the inside out. Shin grew up shadowed, watched, doubted. She could not express hunger, but she fed the sheep with quiet precision. She could not cry out, but she ran to fetch help when a child fell into the river. She lived by gestures, by glances, and by her drawings, because Shin drew. In charcoal, in soot, in berry juice. She drew faces, not the ones people showed, but the ones they hid. She drew grief before it broke. She drew joy still tucked inside silence. She drew women who'd lost children and hadn't said a word, and they'd break down sobbing, just seeing the image. They called her a prophet, but Shin didn't claim anything. She just kept watching, and one year, a famine swept through the land. The church coffers were full, but the people were starving. Shin drew something then, just once, on the church door. A faceless man gorging himself while children wept beneath his table. No name, no words, but the villagers saw it, and within days, the locked cellars were opened. She never admitted it was her. She didn't have to. People began to come from miles away. not to hear her speak, but to be seen, to sit, to be drawn, to be understood without explanation. Shin died young, too young. A fever took her within days. They buried her beneath the oldest tree in the village, and nailed her last charcoal drawing to the trunk. It was a face, soft, unfinished, still becoming. Some say it looks like her, some say it looks like them, but everyone agrees on one thing. It makes them feel seen. Isle, Shind, you're still here, still walking the winding path of forgotten souls, still listening, even as the night deepens into its quietest hour. Not many make it this far, so feel the silence around you, like a blanket woven from the breath of the past. Let your heart beat slower, let your thoughts float, because this story is a hard one, but you're ready. We begin in 17th century Russia, a village near the frozen Volga River, where winter never truly left. It simply slept in the soil, waiting for its cue. And in that village, there was a boy named Pyotr. Pyotr had no eyes, not lost, not gouged, just never there. Where eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin, as if the world had forgotten to finish him. His mother died in childbirth. His father drank until he couldn't stand. The villagers said the boy was cursed, a bad omen made flesh. They left him out in the snow one night, hoping nature would undo what it had done. But he lived. The village healer, a woman with more wrinkles than teeth, found him still breathing at dawn, buried in frost, wrapped in silence. She took him in, taught him to touch bark and tell the tree, taught him to listen to ice and know when it would break, taught him to speak with animals, not in words, but in gesture, vibration, sound. Pyotr never asked for kindness. He just listened, and when the healer died, Pyotr disappeared into the forest. People said he was taken by wolves, but that winter, strange things happened. Lost children were found, safe and sleeping under branches. A hunter who broke his leg was carried back to the village, swearing a blind boy led him home through the storm. And in spring, when the thaw revealed the frozen body of a widow who had gone missing, they found a wreath of wild flowers in her hands. Not common ones, ones that grew only deep in the woods. Someone had found her, held her, given her peace. Pyotr returned once, years later. He stood at the edge of the village, grown tall, face still unreadable, eyes still absent. He did not speak, he did not stay, but the snow around him melted in a perfect circle, like the forest itself had come with him. He walked away again, and was never seen, but he was felt. Some say if you get lost near the river and whisper your name to the wind, Pyotr will come, not to lead you home, but to make sure you're not alone when the dark arrives. And in the warm winds of the Caribbean, hundreds of years later, another story was unfolding. A girl named Amara was born on the island of Saint Domingue, late 1700s, a time of chains, of fire, of revolt. She was born into slavery, a world where her body was not her own, where her breath was taxed, where her silence was survival. But Amara was different, not because she resisted, not because she fought, but because she remembered. She was born with memories, of trees that spoke, of blood that sang, of women with silver bones who danced under red moons. People thought she was mad. She didn't speak until she was 6, and when she did, it was in a language no one recognized, not fully Creole, not fully African, but something older. Older than ships, older than names. The old ones listened, and began to follow her. She didn't preach, she hummed. Soft songs while she worked the cane fields. Songs that made the sun feel gentler. Songs that made children sleep through nightmares. She said her blood carried spirits. She said her body belonged to something deeper than the man who thought he owned her. And one night, when the plantation master struck her down, lightning split the sky with such fury that the fields caught fire. She rose from the ground, bleeding and smiling, and walked into the flames. They never found her body, but the ashes held footprints, and the next morning, every chain in the fields was broken. She became a legend. Amara the Flame-born, Amara the Thunder Walker, Amara who remembered the names of gods the world tried to erase. Years later, when revolution came, when the people rose and the island burned, her songs were still sung. Not loud, soft, like breath through cloth. They say if you hum them at night, near the sugarcane, the air grows warmer, and the sky listens. Pyotr, Amara, one blind to the world, who saw everything. One silenced by chains, who sang creation back into being. Both marked, both forgotten, both unforgettable. They remind us that some are born not just into pain, but into memory, and that memory is power, even if the world tries to bury it. So exhale, long, slow, steady. You stayed, through the echoes, through the shadows, through the long, winding silence of histories forgotten. that matters more than you know. So lie back now. Let your eyes soften. You don't need to do anything else. This last story is not grand. It is not crowned in war or fire. It is not draped in legend or wrapped in miracles. It is quiet, and it is real. And in many ways, it is the story of all of us. It begins in 19th century Ireland, a coastal village, small, wine-bitten, salt-stained, the kind of place where the sea speaks louder than men do. And in that village lived a woman named Niamh. She was born with what we would now call cerebral palsy, but back then, there were no names, only whispers, touched, cursed, wrong. Her limbs moved unpredictably. Her speech was slow, slurred, like a wave dragging across sand. Her gaze wandered, and yet, her eyes never missed a thing. She grew up in a cottage at the edge of the cliffs. No siblings, no friends, only the wine, and her mother, the seamstress who stitched the world back together one thread at a time. Niamh could not sew. Her hands would not allow it. But she watched. She watched the way her mother moved, the rhythm of the needle, the way color met color and turned to story. And one day, while her mother slept, Niamh took a piece of blue cloth and began to weave shells into it. Not with thread, with seaweed, with driftwood, with feathers left by storm birds, a kind of art no one had seen before. She called it a tide cloth. When her mother found it, she wept, not because it was strange, because it was true. Over time, the village began to notice. People who had shunned Niamh now came to her with pieces of their grief. A lock of hair from a drowned husband, a ribbon from a lost child, a coin from a shipwrecked dream. She wove them in, not to erase the pain, to give it shape, so it could breathe, so it could rest. They said her tide cloths could heal, not the body, the soul. She never spoke more than a few words in her life, but her hands, shaky, crooked, persistent, told stories no one else dared to tell. When she died, the villagers buried her with her first cloth, the one with the shells and the seaweed and the bird feathers. They said she should take it with her, to remind the ocean who she was. And now, when the wind howls over those cliffs in late autumn, the locals say it carries her voice, not in words, but in feeling. Like a hand resting on your shoulder, like a memory you didn't know you needed. And far, far from that place, in a different century, under electric lights and humming wires, a boy was born in a hospital room with too many machines. His name doesn't matter, because he could be anyone. He could be you. He was diagnosed early. Labels, files, charts. Doctors used words like severe, nonverbal, low functioning. The world spoke about him, rarely to him. He didn't speak, but he watched. He didn't cry when the tests hurt. He didn't flinch when the stares came. Instead, he lined up toy animals in perfect spirals across the floor. He arranged his meals by color. He screamed, not out of anger, but out of music, because the world was too loud, too bright, too fast, and his mind was deeper than any of them could guess. At age 7, he painted his first picture. Not stick figures, not suns with smiling faces, but a skyline crumbling under stars. A tree with fire in its roots. A boy, alone, wrapped in light. His mother cried when she saw it, because for the first time, she heard him, without words. By 10, his work hung in a gallery. By 12, he gave his first interview through an eye-tracking device, one letter at a time. When they asked how he saw the world, he typed, louder than you think, and more beautiful. Now, people say he's brilliant, but he always was. He just needed a world that stopped speaking long enough to listen. Niamh, the unnamed boy. To souls the world nearly wrote off. To minds shaped not by limits, but by depth. They weren't broken. They were simply speaking a different language. And now, so are you, because you've walked with all of them tonight. The seers, the mourners, the drummers, the diggers, the poets, the prophets, the silenced. You've heard their stories, felt their breath on your skin, watched them walk, however crookedly, through history's locked doors. And now, you carry them. You remember. That is no small thing. That is everything. So sleep now, if you can. Or don't. Just lie here. Still. Alive. Real. Because you've made it to the end of this road. But their stories, their whispers, they'll follow you into the morning. Not to haunt. To hold. To remind you, always, the ones the world tried to bury were often the ones holding the light. You've reached the end, not just of a story, but of a journey through what the world tried to forget. If these voices touch you, if you felt something stir in the silence, then stay with us. There are more stories to tell, more forgotten souls to walk beside, and more quiet truths waiting to be remembered. So if you haven't already, subscribe. Let this space become your refuge, your echo chamber for things too delicate to shout. Leave a comment, tell us where in the world you're listening from, or what part stayed with you the longest. Your voice might just become part of someone else's stillness. And if you know someone who walks a little differently, speaks a little softer, dreams a little deeper, share this with them. Let them know they're not alone in the dark. Until next time, traveler, rest well, stay curious, and never forget, even in the quietest corners of history, the light was always there. You just have to listen for it.